talked about. You say you're running because of your grandchildren, trying to preserve a future for them, build a future for them.
You know, my whole life professionally is concerned with the welfare of children and the well-being of children. And when I retired, I had no intention of going into the public arena. But I couldn't really relax seeing what was happening to the future of the next generations. A lot of people have been convinced that in order to have wisdom, in order to know how to do things, you have to be a dyed-in-the-wool political junkie. You have to have spent time in that arena. And I say you can gain wisdom and experience in lots of other places.
2016 presidential candidate Dr. Ben Carson, part of my exclusive interview with the good doctor before he announced his official run for president. Dr. Carson went on to say that our country is morally and financially bankrupt. Now, it's worth noting the 2016 GOP field has increased exponentially since Ben Carson's announcement. But as we look ahead to this campaign, it's worth asking, who really is Dr. Ben Carson? For his thoughts, let's turn to Newsmax New York, to national affairs columnist for National Review Online and Newsmax contributor John Fund. John, your perception of Dr. Carson and his actual biography, how do they compare?
Well, if you were to look at the kind of accomplishments someone has made in their life, whether they've really touched and helped people, probably Ben Carson comes out on top of the entire Republican field. He has been a tremendous inspiration to people. He has started scholarship programs that have helped thousands of kids around the country achieve their dreams. And of course, as a brain surgeon, he literally has saved people's lives and engaged in some of the most pioneering and experimental surgery. So he's an American hero. Translating that to politics is a bit different, and he's had some rough spots, but he's adapting pretty well. And I've been to Iowa, and I've attended meetings where he has addressed audiences, and I've never seen someone with more committed volunteers and support that is as endearing as his.
Do the involvement and the passion of those volunteers, John, does that surprise you?
Well, you always wonder, you know, who is going to capture people's imaginations. And even though everyone talks about Jeb Bush, or they talk about Scott Walker, or they talk about Marco Rubio, actually, even though they may have less of a bank account and less volunteers, the people who you really get excited about, the candidates this year, are in favor of Ben Carson, or they're in favor of Carly Fiorina, or perhaps even, once again, Rick Santorum was running again. They have really committed audiences out there. And in Iowa, which of course is a caucus state, emphasizing grassroots, that can make a difference.
Now, you talked about him being a newcomer to politics. During my exclusive interview with him, the good doctor told me that the most surprising thing he found after deciding to run for president was where the naysayers were coming from. Let's listen to what he said, and then I'd like to get your reaction.
Probably the thing that surprised me the most is not so much the left-wing media attempting to stop me, but the torpedoes that come from the right.
So the whole notion of fighting for this nomination, it surprises him, some of the sharp elbows. Is he a tough enough guy to handle that, given his soft-spoken persona?
We'll see. Obviously, some of the torpedoes are expected because competitors are not going to let him steal their volunteers and his supporters. So that's understandable. I think some of the torpedoes that he's mentioning come from the Republican consultant class, because let's face it, he's running a shoestring campaign and he's not hiring those consultants. So those consultants tend to be very jealous of candidates who break out of the mold, who don't surround themselves with the usual consultants. And as a result, there's a lot of sniping. And as you know, consultants are often the best sources for journalists, so they can get their views out there.
John, we've got about a minute left, and the polls are out there, and it's very interesting what they're showing us about Dr. Carson. You mentioned the volunteers in Iowa and elsewhere. It appears that he has a fairly solid constituency, relatively speaking, given all the folks who want to run this time in the GOP. 40 seconds for your assessment, sir.
Well, he has to do extremely well in Iowa, where it's a state that he can meet voters one-on-one. Then he has to be able to quickly pivot and parlay that into strong showings in New Hampshire and in South Carolina and Nevada, the early states. As of now, that's a big, daunting task, and he'd certainly be a big underdog. I will say this, win or lose, we're going to hear more from Dr. Carson, either in the cabinet of a Republican president, should they win in 2016, or somebody who's on the short list for vice president in 2016.
We will keep taking a look at this, and John Fund, we appreciate your time. So you heard what John had to say, your opinion of Dr. Carson. We'd love to hear from you. You can email me, also use Facebook, Twitter, or our website.